Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Content Intelligence, 5 Use Cases on the Frontier of Machine Learning. I'm Allison Jersky, Manager of Events at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. With me today are John Mancini of AIIM and Andrew Perry of ABBY. ABBY is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking time to join us today. As we get started, let me just share a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience. Feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. Across the bottom of your screen is the list of all the widgets available to you. Group chat is open to you too. Open this by clicking on the icons that's along the bottom. With group chat, you'll be able to text chat with each other and also with some of us from AIIM. And please do ask questions to the speakers throughout the hour using the Q&A feature. We'll hold them until the end, where we should have about 5 to 10 minutes to answer them. You can also use this feature to ask for any technical assistance. You can download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list. There are also a few other documents and links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Just click in here at any time. The resource will open up in a new browser tab, and you can save and read them after the webinar. At the end of this webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and it's also in the widgets below the slide area. We'd appreciate if you take a few moments and offer your feedback and suggest other topics for us to cover. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in a few days. John Mancini is the Chief Evangelist of AIIM. He is a well-known author and speaker on information management and digital transformation. As a frequent keynote speaker, John offers his expertise on digital transformation and the struggle to overcome information chaos. He blogs under the title Digital Landfill and has published scores of ebooks, many of which can be found at AIIM.org/research. Andrew Perry is a marketing executive with over 25 years of experience in the high technology sector, focusing on content management and business process automation. Andrew holds a Master's of Law degree from Northwestern University, is a certified information privacy professional, and a certified information professional. Now let me turn this over to John Mancini to begin today's talk. John?
Thank you, Al. It's really a pleasure to be here today. It's especially a privilege to be here today with Andrew. Andrew and I have known each other for quite some time in a variety of different incarnations. And most recently, we worked together on some GDPR projects. And so I think you're in for a bit of a treat here in terms of Andrew's depth of knowledge of this topic of content intelligence, and particularly how it ties to some of the business issues that you face. And that was the reason why we tried to focus this webinar around use cases and to try to give it a little bit more of a feel once we kind of cover some of the positioning of what we're going to talk about today. So like a lot of webinars, we're going to talk about 3 things. Usually like to divide the world into buckets of 3. And the way this will work is that I'll share some data from some of our surveys to sort of set the stage. I'll probably do that a little bit longer on the first 2 questions, and then Andrew will have a little bit of perspective on those questions. And then a little bit more length as we get into the practical use cases. Andrew will take over and kind of guide us through that. So that's the agenda for today. I'm very excited to be here with you and talk about this. This is a pretty exciting intersection between unstructured information and machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's really at the edges of what the industry is all about. And so as you think about this, one of the things I usually like to start with is, just a sense of, well, why are we here and why is this important and why are we talking about this? And so I think everybody has a sense that the world is a pretty disrupted place right now. And I'm not just talking about politically or economically, but in terms of technology. There's an awful lot of disruption out there. And so I look back and think about other times in which we had lots of disruption, when TVs first came into the marketplace, when LANs and PCs first came, when the internet came with mobile devices. And I think now, we're at the cusp of another big disruption. And it's reflected in some of the challenges that people feel in their traditional business models. And so this particular question we asked a few months ago, and as you can see from the data here, over 50% of the organizations that we surveyed basically feel that they could face a serious disruption in their business model in the next 2 years. That's pretty dramatic when you think about the pace of traditional pace of change, and think about how that pace of change has accelerated. So we went from there to ask folks, well, what are you doing about this? And clearly people see digital transformation as a key ingredient in their strategy to combat that disruption. Over 80% of the folks that we talked to basically said that digital transformation was either very important or important to their companies. We went from there to say, and this is where things get a little hairy for organizations. We said, okay, you've said that this is important to you, and where are you with regards to that journey? And specifically, take a milestone that's immediately out there, 2020, what percent of the way are you to where you'd like to be? And what you can see is that people's intentions and the reality that they face are somewhat at variance right now. So as we thought about that, and as I thought about, okay, well, why have some of these transformation initiatives failed? I started to look a little bit deeper at some of the data that we talked through in our surveys, and this was actually an example of a question that we asked our community 10 years ago to do a self-assessment of where they were in terms of their information competency. And what it said to me, so we asked the same question again just a couple months ago, and what was interesting to me is that what came out of that is there's an awful lot of running faster and faster to stay in the same place. And people's self-assessment of where they are is not materially different than where they said they were 10 years ago, which reflects the torrent of information that's coming at them. So we also asked folks this question. We asked them to look at the tactical question of different types of information. And so this gets a little more positive when you think about this. When you start looking at this question, this one says basically that things have improved, but if you look at the criteria, what the percentage refers to, and this is not exactly a high bar. People that say that these different forms of information in their organization are either chaotic or somewhat unmanaged, you can still see that while things have improved since 2013, 5 years ago, they still are at a pretty challenging place right now. So when you think about this and think about, well, why is that? I think this is really an interesting jumping off point to start thinking about content intelligence and thinking about some of the areas that you can focus on immediately in terms of increasing the likelihood of success of your transformation initiatives. And that's, when you start looking at this question of digitizing and standardizing the business inputs coming into your organization. And so I think people have realized that there is a connection between that and the likelihood of their success at digital transformation. I can also give you an additional data point that we haven't released yet from a survey that I've just done that I'll be publishing in the next couple of weeks. And we asked people, take a look at the information coming into your organization right now and consider that to be X. And what do you think that will be in 2 years? And the average came back 4.2X. So a four-fold increase in that volume. And I think one of the key things to think about relative to content intelligence is that how it fits into this question of digitizing and standardizing the inputs as it comes into the organization, because that torrent is growing, and unless you hit it right at the get-go, it's going to be very hard to do it in the way that we've traditionally done it, which is retroactively. So with that, let me switch over, and Andrew, why don't you give kind of a couple perspectives on some of the issues that I've raised and some of the things that you'd like to share.
Oh, thanks, John. And certainly, just to reinforce the data points that you shared, from my perspective, there are three drivers behind digitization. The first driver is compliance. So in my practice as a data privacy professional, one of the biggest hurdles to privacy compliance is siloed data repositories, which makes it really challenging to determine where personal data is stored and processed. And of course, more rigorous privacy regulations, such as the EU General Data Protection Regulation now, impose much higher standards on data controllers to safeguard privacy rights. And so without digitization, the ability to mitigate compliance risks is problematic and may in fact expose organizations to considerable liabilities, given the onerous enforcement regime inherent in GDPR. Now, the second driver is really taking transaction costs out of the business. So, for example, take the procure-to-pay business process where, surprisingly, invoice capture still tends to be manual, keying off the invoices. But recently, the Hackett Group conducted a study of the benefits of digitization within the procurement function, and I found that the application of intelligent capture and machine learning has proven to generate more than 10 times the return on investment than those companies that really have not leveraged AI and machine learning technologies. And then thirdly, the third driver is to improve customer engagement and service levels that foster, sort of enduring customer loyalty and repeat business, such as customer onboarding and customer sentiment analysis. So in the final analysis, data is really the medium of exchange, and it enables organizations to compete in the digital economy, which is growing 5 times the overall economy. But underlying all of this is the need for the information governance and a holistic information governance strategy that enables organizations to preserve business records, leverage information and business value, and then delete the rest. And research, in fact, has shown that 20% of corporate information holdings may be deleted through rigorous information governance best practices and through the application of intelligent capture, classification, and extraction technologies, or what's defined as content intelligence, which John will explore with you in the next few slides.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Andrew. This slide is particularly interesting to me. Like I said, I'm working right now on writing up the results from our Automating Compliance and Governance survey. And one of the questions deals with how people deal with this red part of your pie here. And, not to spoiler alert in terms of the new research, but people basically come back and they are 60–70% of users are still handling that red piece of the pie with manual processes. And so, clearly there's room for improvement in how you deal with that, and particularly when you start thinking about issues like privacy and compliance and legal exposure moving forward. So let's hop to the second topic, get a little bit more technology-centric, if you will, and wanted to share some of the data and also just reinforce for all of you how AIIM views the world, how we kind of see these points connecting together, and just give you a sense of the technology side before hopping into the use cases. So when we talk to folks, if you go back to the first part that I went through, that people see disruption as a priority for their organization. They see digital transformation as a means to combat that disruption. They're a bit frustrated in their transformation initiatives. And one of the reasons that they're being frustrated in their transformation initiatives is that they're being overwhelmed by the volume of content and information coming into their organizations. What you find is a rising sense that they need a more modern approach of looking at these questions, that running in place idea, of running faster and faster just isn't going to work in an environment in which the volume of information is going to grow by 4.2x over the next 2 years. And so as people think about this is one of the reasons that we started talking about the interconnected elements that we call intelligent information management. And one of the points here is that I usually get asked is like, oh, is this a replacement for ECM? Is this a market segment? What is this? And really what it is, it's if you want to think about it, it's a way of viewing the world, and it's a story, I think, that weaves together the different components of information management into an overall strategy and approach moving forward. So we don't see this as a market segment. Probably the constituent elements on this slide are the market segments. But intelligent information management is basically a set of disciplines, a set of approaches, a way of looking at the world. And so, as we think about intelligent information management, we think there's three buckets, if you will, that organizations need to think about. And these are content services, process services, and analytics services. And we use the word services intentionally because I think one of the big changes that has occurred in the world is that people expect these technology building blocks to be accessible to each other and expect processes to be accessible to each other in a much more transparent way than they traditionally have been. Traditionally, when you think about each of these technology building blocks, it's often like you have like Legos and Duplos and an erector set and Lincoln logs, and they're all pieces that don't fit together. And so people are starting to move towards an environment of thinking of this as services, thinking of each of these technology elements as building blocks that can be added to each other depending on the context in which you are trying to get work done. And so when we poll people and we ask them, okay, well, tell us a little bit about your spending plans, I think it's really interesting because, even though people are wrestling with where do they go with regards to modernizing their legacy systems, there's a forward lean, if you will. And, the real life world that people have on a day-to-day basis doesn't go away. And so, this challenge of modernizing your legacy systems is somewhat akin to, trying to rewire the house with the juice on. And so the way people have approached that is basically say, okay, let's think about some of the core technologies that we can use to augment and refine what we're currently doing so that we can make a transition to a more modern infrastructure, but not just create total chaos in the process. So when you think about analytics services, for example, the way to look at this chart is that those bars on the right side of each grouping, those are the folks that basically say that they are either talking to vendors, that they are actively researching, or they need to get started. So that basically is the forward lean, if you will, I think, when it comes to things like content analytics and semantics and data recognition and multi-channel intelligent capture and PII identification. Clearly people are looking to add those capabilities to what they're currently doing. Similarly, when you come down and look at this in spending plans and get a little bit more tangible in terms of what folks are doing, and what you see is that orangey one and that reddish side there, but people planning to spend more and a lot more. And what's going on here in terms of kind of their research definitely complements what's going on here in terms of their spending plans, in terms of their desire to get more serious about this and spend more and invest more in some of these solutions moving forward. So let me turn that back around to Andrew a bit and kind of get your take on sort of that forward lean that people have and how you guys see it.
Yeah, well, thanks, John, for that analysis. In fact, I would agree that information management or intelligent information management consists of three main pillars, content services, process services, and analytics services. But while all these three pillars are important, the most challenging yet strategically vital pillar is analytics services that enables organizations to surface, extract, and transform information into actionable intelligence. And invariably, such information is found and buried in unstructured and semi-structured documents such as contracts. And think of it this way, as shown in this chart, a typical Fortune 1000 company manages anywhere between 20,000 to 40,000 contracts annually. And research has shown that 10% of these contracts are misplaced, predominantly through manual error or misfiling. And that actually can constitute or contribute up to 9% of an organization's annual turnover, which is a significant cost to businesses. And in fact, extracting intelligence from contracts is not an easy task. There are many instances of contracts that span non-disclosure agreements, lease agreements, trade finance transactions, and so forth. And of course, it's very important to surface those elements of an agreement that relate to risk and obligations. And of course, these demand the application of automated processes around content intelligence applications. And just to reinforce that point, recently the International Association for Contracts and Commercial Management found that a spend on a basic standard low-risk procurement contract has in fact increased 38% in the past 6 years to an average of $6,900 per contract. And of course, the reason for that is predominantly, manual reviews or inefficient ways in which contracts are being managed. And I focus in on contracts because there are a number of key pain points with respect to contracts. The first is, it's really surprising that the availability of automated processes notwithstanding, a significant majority of organizations simply do not have visibility into where their contracts are located, be it on shared drives or email servers or content management repositories or even in file cabinets. Second is the absence of standardized nomenclature that precludes sufficient searching for key terms and obligations within agreements. And then if you don't know where your contracts are and you don't have sufficient metadata tagging and nomenclature, then you cannot really analyze your contracts. And as a result, you don't have enough visibility into any sort of risk exposures. And so, contract analytics then enables organizations to realize as much as 30% savings in contract administration costs and 20% savings in costs associated with the obligations analysis. And this is where some of the more forward-looking technologies that John mentioned around intelligent capture, classification technologies, natural language processing comes into play. And John will sort of highlight some of these technologies and now kind of pivot into a more detailed conversation around the specific use cases where these technologies can apply and deliver value.
Andrew, I really like the fact that you're focusing on contracts here because it's such an interesting form of content when you think about it, because we have a long history and legacy of dealing with semi-structured documents like an invoice, and even though there's a lot of organizations that still can get enormous value out of automating that process, the computational and management challenge associated with extracting information from a semi-structured document is it's much more complex when you deal with an unstructured document like a contract. And I just find that really, really interesting in terms of this particular point, these pain points that you're dealing with, because contracts are a good example. It's mission critical. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of money at stake. But there's not a lot of standardization in terms of what those contracts look like, and so it makes the extraction of the information a much more complicated task. So let me hop to the next one, and I'm just going to tee up this very quickly and then hand the steering wheel to Andrew to talk about some of the use cases here. This is actually an Abby slide here that talks about some of the components of content intelligence. And I thought I would just talk from this as a little bit of an introduction to Andrew's use cases because I like it a lot, because I think it covers some of the elements that, again, are more forward-leaning in terms of what makes up content intelligence. And it also represents a bit of a hierarchy and a bit of a stair-stepping that organizations can think about, going from document processing, which we've all been doing for a number of years in this space, to moving to intelligently classifying information, extracting data. As I said, some forms of data extraction are more complicated than others. And then actually, as you start getting into natural language processing and actually understanding the content of a document, that flow, that hierarchy, I think is interesting, and I think might be a useful place to start thinking about some of the use cases. So, Andrew, why don't you take it over from here? And I would also just remind everybody that there is a question tab there, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end, and so feel free to tee up some of those questions. So, Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, John. So I will, focus on 5 specific use cases, as you've seen on this chart here. And I will explore these use cases that span across tactical transactional processes such as procure-to-pay, to strategic processes such as obligations compliance and portfolio risk analysis. And in particular, I will review the challenges associated with each of these use cases, how content intelligence technologies are applied, and then the business benefits associated with each of these particular use cases. So I'll talk about contract renewals, procure-to-pay types of applications, terms and conditions compliance, and then contract risk and portfolio risk analysis. So let me go to the first particular use case, and that's Evergreen Agreements. Now, what's astounding and astonishing is that according to the Gartner Group, an astonishing 60% of all supplier contracts now are Evergreen Agreements. Now, just from a definitional point of view, an evergreen contract continues to renew until one party decides to terminate the contract prior to the renewal date. Now, a number of states have implemented legislation that requires the Evergreen Agreements to include a clear and conspicuous clause relating to automatic renewal and giving purchasers 30 days notice to terminate. Now, there's, of course, both an upside and a downside to an Evergreen Agreement. The upside is that certainly an automatic renewal clause provides business continuity of the business relationships without the need to kind of renegotiate the terms. That's a positive thing. On the downside, though, evergreen contracts can and do create significant risks. So, for example, often the renewal date is simply forgotten. Contracts may be misfiled, or there may be staff turnover, which, of course, creates significant risks to organizations. So how do you solve this? How do you mitigate this risk here? Well, for example, you can apply named entity extraction and regular expression technologies that allow you to identify and extract specific terms within a contract. For example, terms relating to the date of the agreement, the renewal date, or the notice period required to terminate, which may be extracted. And then once you extract that information, then you can upload that to a contract lifecycle management system, all the metadata and the terms that you extracted for tracking purposes and to alert staff before the agreement comes up for renewal. Now, if you're not proactive with Evergreen Agreements, the consequences may be quite drastic. Not only are you losing negotiating leverage, but also you're compelled to comply with the financial obligations, which can be quite onerous. And courts typically enforce evergreen contracts, particularly if notice of renewal is clear and unambiguous. And so it's really incumbent on organizations to apply these very simple, proven technologies like entity extraction to analyze and extract supplier performance obligations and make sure that you are able to proactively manage the renewal of these evergreen contracts. Let me switch to the next use case, which is really procure-to-pay. And in this context, contract analytics is an important tool and monitor procure-to-pay contract performance. And what procure-to-pay contract analytics involves is the ability to track purchases against contracts, to track discount rates. Are they adhered to? Is the supplier providing the rebates that you've expected in the agreement as per the obligation? So as shown in this chart, one of the key challenges for finance organizations is the ability to match supplier performance against contract terms and obligations. And again, using entity extraction, classification technologies, you're able to identify and extract this metadata from your agreements and being able to then proactively measure the performance of your suppliers relative to the obligations in the contract. Now, in accordance with recent research by Evergreen, they found that by applying these kinds of technologies, organizations can, in fact, improve their productivity by as much as 50% in being able to have better visibility into their contracts and being able to analyze contracts more proactively. Now, furthermore, by implementing a contract analytics solution, you're able to examine your supplier's performance, and, for example, extend preferential terms to high-performing suppliers, extend perhaps early payment discounts, which may result in higher returns on your invested capital and an improved profitability. And then finally, it's not just about analyzing discrete contracts, but it's really incumbent on organizations to look at their entire portfolio of contracts across their different products and geographic regions, so that they could identify potential risks, maybe some exposures driven by geopolitical concerns or exchange rate fluctuations, and the impact of adverse economic and financial policies. So there's a clear linkage between structured information like invoice capture and procure to pay, which deals with highly structured data, with contracts that tend to have a lot of unstructured information. But the ability to correlate that is very important to extract negotiated terms with suppliers and manage that process more effectively. Now, one of the key emerging use cases is around compliance, and in particular, privacy-related compliance. Now, clearly, the EU GDPR legislation is a significant development in the protection of privacy rights. And while it is a EU legislation, it impacts virtually all U.S. entities that are deemed to do business with EU data subjects. And the ambition of the legislation is to strengthen data subject rights, to provide for more rigorous data processor and controller accountability, also more robust breach notification requirements, of course, coupled with more onerous enforcement and penalties. And of course, all of this, require a more rigorous obligations analysis to determine, potential compliance gaps and take appropriate remediation steps to address those gaps. And as a controller or processor, they are required to now maintain a record of processing activities that ought to include, for example, the lawful basis for processing. What are the purposes of processing personal information, and a description of the categories of data subjects that are being managed and processed within the organization. And so all of this requires prudent and careful analysis of all of your data processing agreements. In fact, data processing agreements are governed by a binding contract, and compliance with GDPR now requires a review of all existing agreements, undertake a clause-by-clause comparison between the GDPR terms and all your existing agreements, and identify the gaps. So how do you apply technologies or content intelligence technologies to achieve these ambitious, obviously, requirements? So the first is to populate your agreements into a repository. That may involve digitization of all existing contracts. In many cases, you may deal with third-party contracts, so you have to digitize and capture that information into a repository. Then you are able to then go to the next step, which is really creating a logical segmentation and classification of your agreements into specific clauses, and then comparing them against predefined clause libraries that contain the appropriate GDPR provisions, and then do a comparative analysis between your agreements and what's contained in the GDPR provisions. And once that's done, and you create these section documents, you can then apply specific applications of natural language processing that allows you to extract information in context of these agreements, and being able to analyze those agreements and infer meaning in context based on these agreements, and be able to analyze these agreements and be able to take specific steps to make sure that you're compliant with these regulations. And as you can see on this slide, the level of expenditure is significantly increasing around GDPR. So in fact, the world's 500 biggest corporations are now on track to spend a total of nearly $8 billion to comply with GDPR. On average, a mid-sized company can expect to spend anywhere between $100,000 to $500,000 on GDPR-related initiatives and best practices and technologies. So content intelligent solutions clearly help in this process to accelerate and streamline these processes. Now, there's another major compliance initiative that's impacting organizations, which is defined as the Accounting Standards Codification 606. Now, This is a mouthful, but it is a initiative of the Financial Accounting Standards Board and the International Standards Board that defines new rules for revenue recognition. And it requires the application of 5 steps. So the first step is to identify the contract with the customer. So that means that you have to understand what kind of contracts you have, so you have to classify your contracts based on their subject matter. Secondly, you have to identify the performance obligations within the contract. So that requires segmentation of the contract into specific clauses to look at the obligations, the warranties and liabilities that you may have within a contract. And then thirdly, then you have to isolate and determine the transaction price for a given deliverable or service. And so you have to apply entity extraction technology to identify the dollar value of the contracts, the obligations within your agreements. And then you'll be able to appropriate and allocate the appropriate transaction price to particular service delivered. Now, organizations, have many, many supplier contracts, thousands, tens of thousands of these contracts. As you can see on this chart, one of the biggest challenges by finance organizations is, in fact, to gain visibility into these agreements and being able to effectively analyze their portfolio of agreements across multiple suppliers and multiple customers. A significant challenge for organizations. And then finally, I'd like to talk about M&A transactions or portfolio risk analysis. And, M&A, requires an evaluation of a wide range of agreements and obligations during the due diligence process. And for publicly traded companies, this due diligence needs to be completed within 60 to 90 days. And that's an onerous requirement. And of course, linear reviews of these agreements could be quite expensive. And in fact, in terms of the total legal expenses, contract review constitutes anywhere from 30 to 60% of the total legal fees. So the application of technology is extremely important to streamline and reduce these costs. And there are several areas where content intelligence technologies can play a significant role to reduce these costs. So first, obviously in an M&A process, the acquirer needs to assume the commitments and liabilities and obligations of the company. So the agreements that need to be reviewed span across guarantees, loans, credit agreements, leases, and so forth, IP rights. So the first step is to digitize all these agreements. As I pointed out earlier, with 20 to 40,000 contracts and being distributed all over the organization, you need to create a central registry or repository of these agreements. So the first step is to digitize, classify these agreements, and move them into a centralized repository. The second is the application of machine learning-based document understanding building blocks that allow you to identify specific terms within the documents and being able to analyze your obligations and liabilities of the acquired company. And then third, the segmentation and use of NLP or natural language-based processing technologies that automatically extracts and contextualizes content in the context of these agreements. And then finally is to conduct, clause comparison within the agreements, to escalate potential problematic clauses for human review by senior legal counsel. And the combination of all these technologies then enables you to really significantly streamline the process and cut the costs of your due diligence process from anywhere from 20 to 80% based on these technologies. So having reviewed these use cases, I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes on how ABI addresses these capabilities. And all of the use cases that I referenced are all examples of how content intelligence technologies may be applied. And that is, ABI's core competency. Our portfolio of intelligent capture and text analytics are designed to capture and digitize and extract, meaningful data from multiple channels, identify the relationships between these documents, and deliver insights from these documents. And obviously, the fundamental ambition is to transform these documents into business value and creating actionable intelligence around which you can make informed business decisions. around several use cases, contracts being one of them. Obviously, there's a whole range of other types of applications, whether it's a customer-facing onboarding applications or structured applications like invoice processing and case management. Finally, I'd just like to say a few words about ABBY's core competencies as a company. The company operates in 200 countries, over 1,000 employees, and one of the key core competencies of the company is the ability to process text in multiple languages to transform that information into actionable intelligence. And in fact, over 50 million people from over 200 countries are utilizing and leveraging ABBY products and solutions and capabilities. And of course, we are very proud to work with a strong network of strategic and value-added partners and systems integrators that continue to add incremental value to our suite of products and technologies. And clearly our strength is around content intelligence and solving these vexing, difficult problems in gaining insights to documents. So with that, John and I think we'll kind of highlight some of the key takeaways from this presentation. From my perspective, there are 5 key takeaways. First and foremost, information governance is key. Without information governance, none of this technology, would make sense. You have to really understand, your information holdings and conduct a data mapping and data discovery. And information governance obviously not only helps in mitigating your risks, but also is designed to strengthen your corporate brand and foster, enduring customer loyalty. And that's really critical in the digital economy. The second is data discovery and data mapping and digitize and digitize and digitize. Without digitization, that's the first key step towards competing in the digital economy. And that's the first key step to ensure that you are able to transform all your documents into a machine-readable format so that they can be consumed and integrated into various types of applications, whether it's risk management or customer-facing types of applications. And then thirdly, in terms of a practical suggestion, is don't try to boil the ocean. There are many instances of content intelligence, but you have to identify quick wins. And for example, it might be just simply document capture, intelligent capture to digitize your documents. It may be a simple, robotic process application to automate highly labor-intensive and repetitive processes like invoice automation, and then add additional value to that in terms of content intelligence solutions that are more advanced. And then finally, which I really want to emphasize, and that is privacy rights. I think compliance is becoming top of mind for most organizations, and it's important to subscribe to the highest possible standard, because it's not just about protecting privacy rights, but also by doing so, you are implementing technologies that allows you to minimize the amount of personal information that you're utilizing. You're able to track that information more effectively. You're able to mitigate your potential breach-related issues, but also you're a good corporate citizen, and you're able to deliver significant value to organizations and confidence that you consider that information to be a strategic asset and you protect that information accordingly. So those are my thoughts in terms of the key takeaways from this presentation. But John, I reach out to you as well to share some of your thoughts as well.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really terrific and really, really interesting. And there's one particular thing I wanted to just comment on, and while I do so, I thought I'd put this link up here so that folks can make sure that they download the white paper from you. I mentioned earlier that you and I had worked a bit on a couple of GDPR publications, and so your comments about GDPR were interesting to me. And a data point in our survey, which actually reinforces some of the data that you were talking about, was that we asked people how much money they had spent on GDPR compliance prior to the May 25th deadline that they had, and the average that came back in the survey that we did was 3.5 million euro, and the median was 500,000 euro. which really dovetails, I think, very well with the numbers that you were talking about amongst the large fortune scale companies, as well as the 100,000 to 500,000 that was characteristic of a typical mid-sized company as well. And so, for me, I think that's an example of why it's so important to go through all the steps that you talked about here in terms of basic information governance, in terms of digitizing everything that you can find, in terms of getting things in a fashion such that you can actually manage it intelligently. Because those costs about GDPR are just one regulation, one set of circumstances, and most organizations have tens, if not hundreds, of those to somehow deal with along the way. The other part, which I thought was interesting, is that the spend doesn't stop with the May 25th deadline in terms of getting ready for it. Organizations have the follow-up question, which is that as they get requests from customers to either see all their information in machine-readable format, or transfer that, or get rid of it, or what have you, there are ongoing costs that increase significantly if that information is not readily available in a digital format. And so, I found that your comments about that really interesting. And the last one, which was also GDPR specific, but also ties to this contract area, I really found your comments about the mapping of GDPR obligations to existing contracts and being able to find where there's points of variance in those tens of thousands of contracts that people have. That's a real interesting confluence of both the contracts management piece and contracts analytics piece that you were talking about, as well as the GDPR compliance piece. So, so those are kind of my takeaways, if you will. I wanted to make sure that we had our contact information up here so that folks do it. And we do have some questions and have a time for a few questions here. And so let me just tee a couple of these up, and if folks want to hit the question button, they are welcome to. So first question I saw here was actually tied to GDPR, and this person said, and we talked a little bit about this, but it might be useful. They say, you talked about GDPR. How does it comply to U.S. companies, and what should one do to determine if we are required to comply? So maybe talk about that question specifically from a U.S. perspective.
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned in my prepared comments, while GDPR is an EU regulation, its extraterritorial jurisdiction applies to any U.S. entity that's deemed to do business with EU data subjects. And the GDPR regulation defines this quite broadly, in that you don't have to have a physical presence in terms of facilities within the EU. But if, for example, if you use top-level domains on your website targeting EU member states, or, for example, you're delivering services in local EU languages, or you sell or service your products in euro currency, then, and also if you're advertising to EU users or monitoring EU data subjects, you are likely subject to the jurisdiction of GDPR, which means then you have to comply with the enhanced data subject rights. And one of the fundamental differences between somewhat sectoral U.S. data privacy legislation and the EU harmonized legislation is that under GDPR now, affirmative consent is absolutely required in order to collect and process personal information versus implied consent that still is permissible within the U.S. jurisdiction. The second is with respect to information transparency. So, for example, under the GDPR, data subjects can request information from data controllers, and they must provide that information within 30 days. Now, if you don't have effective data governance and data capture and classification capabilities, you will be hard-pressed to comply with that requirement. And then what's really, really key is what's called data portability under GDPR. And that is that the data subjects can request their personal information, and the data controller or processor must provide that information in a machine-readable format. And if you can't do that, you could potentially be liable for infringing upon GDPR requirements, and they are quite onerous. For substantive violations, it could be up to 20 million euros or 4% of your annual turnover. So the legislation has quite a significant teeth to it. So it's really incumbent on the organization to figure out whether or not you really need to comply with the EU Data General Protection Regulation. And then finally, I would like to point out that there are a number of U.S. initiatives now underway that will bring U.S. privacy law more in line with GDPR. So the California Consumer Protection Act is incorporating features. There are other state legislatures that are bringing data protection rights more or less on par with the GDPR. And then, of course, finally is data transfer. So, you need to comply with the adequacy standard of GDPR to transfer data from EU jurisdictions to the U.S., and you need to comply with the provisions of the new Privacy Shield. So lots of things to consider here.
I think we have time for one more question, and any of the ones that we didn't get to, you guys will be able to follow up after the webinar. But this might be a good opportunity to just get everybody on kind of a level set playing field. And this person asked, you guys talked about AI, you talked about machine learning, you talked about deep learning. Can you shed a little bit more light on what the differences are between these two, and kind of, just kind of your perspective on how they're similar and how they're different, and, just a little definitional set?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because these terms are used somewhat interchangeably, but they actually mean quite different things. So AI, or artificial intelligence, is really sort of the top of the food chain, and that's sort of a broad-based concept that encompasses how computers can apply advanced algorithms to make decisions and process information without necessarily being programmed. But then within it, machine learning is a subset of it, and typically machine learning falls into two categories. One is sort of supervised machine learning, where there are specific rules-based criteria for processing information. That's typically very helpful for highly structured applications, repetitive applications like invoice processing, whereas the more advanced forms of machine learning, like natural language processing or latent semantic analysis, deal with more contextual analysis of terms and content in context within documents. There are many different iterations of this. But clearly these technologies are evolving. The most advanced of these are rules-based, supervised learning types of machine learning capabilities that organizations typically use.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that when you think about the term AI, for example, AI's been around for 50, 60 years, goes all the way back even to the mid-50s in a Dartmouth group that first got together and talked about it. And as you say, it's evolved into a lot of different manifestations, but it also the terms are used interchangeably when they really imply quite different things, and I think that's an important distinction. So I think we're just about out of time, and Al, I think I'm supposed to return to you, and you'll kind of bring us to a close.
Yep, thanks, John. And thank you again, Andrew, for sharing so much knowledge and information in such a short amount of time, so thanks. I just wanted to touch on the AIIM conference real quick, a subject near and dear to my heart as AIIM's event specialist. I would love for you all to join us in San Diego for AIIM's annual conference. It's in March 2019. Last year's conference sold out, so check out what's being planned and register now to secure your spot. For more information, go to aimconference.com. I'm really excited for you guys to see what we have in store and to find out what tricks we have up our sleeves this year. So we're at the end of our webinar hour, and we've been listening to John Mancini and Andrew Perry. A reminder that we have recorded this webinar, and it will be available the next day or two at AIIM.org's resources webinars page. Don't forget to download the resources in the list to the right of the slide area. Also, please take our brief survey that will open up on your desktop as the webinar ends. We value your feedback and would love to hear from you guys. And thank you to our underwriter, Abby. Without support from our solutions providers, we wouldn't be able to bring you free educational programs like our webinar. And as we bring this webinar to a close, I want to leave you with our speakers' closing thoughts from today's discussion. So we can start with Andrew, and then you could move it over to John. Just a quick closing thought on the topic of today.
Yes, thanks so much, Allison. You know, my closing thought would be that this sort of content intelligence market is evolving very rapidly. The demand for content intelligence solutions is accelerating for the reasons that I mentioned, and there are many other types of use cases, of course, that we haven't covered around content intelligence that span across, search, predictive analytics, customer sentiment analysis. All of these are really emerging technologies that create a lot of value. And finally, I would say that, content intelligence is the engine that drives competition in the digital economy. Without, these kinds of advanced capabilities, organizations will be really hard-pressed to maintain, sustainable competitive advantages in the digital economy, which, as I mentioned earlier, is growing 5 times the overall global economy. So these are important topics, and of course, we at ADI are committed. This is our core competency and mission in life is to help companies, transform their information into a competitive advantage.
Great, thank you. John, any closing thoughts from today's discussion?
I think just my closing thought is actually a resource tip, if you will, which is that if you were intrigued by some of the data that we went through, it's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we gather and that we make available to AIM professional members. And so just this year, for example, we published a whole series of benchmarking studies, one on intelligent information management, a second on digitalizing core business processes, a third on GDPR implementation, a fourth that will be released in the next couple of weeks focused on automating compliance and governance, and then 2 more the rest of the year that are one focused on Office 365 and then another focused on deep learning and machine learning. And so all of those in all of the details, a lot of folks have said that they're extremely helpful as they benchmark their own operations. So if you're an AIM professional member, just make sure you find those on the AIM website and download them and take a look at it. And if you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to contact me. So I just wanted to thank everybody for being there. We appreciate your time. Hopefully we have given you some deep learning opportunities here, or at least some learning opportunities. And Andrew, I really appreciate you being on the call today. I always learn something when I listen to you, and I really appreciate the depth of knowledge that you bring to all these issues that we talk about. So thank you.
Likewise, John. It was a real pleasure collaborating with you on this webinar, and I look forward to participating in other webinars that come up in the future.
All righty. So until the next, go ahead, Al, take us out.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew and Abby. And thank you all for joining us. And for AIM, this is Allison Jersky, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.